remains faced with a host of diverse challenges. Insecurity, poverty and corruption are just the tip of the iceberg. Here's CGTN's Phil Ihaza taking up the story from Nigeria's capital, Abuja.
Francis Okoli has run an interior decoration business for a decade now. But he says the last 4 years have been challenging.
We have this goods for more than 2 years or 3 years, and we cannot sell it. So we want government to do something so that people can afford our goods, so that money can flow for everyone to buy goods and to maintain their house.
After a hotly contested election campaign, incumbent President Muhammadu Buhari beat over 70 opponents, including a major opposition figure and former Vice President Atiku Abubakar. Mr. Buhari won the 2015 elections after promising to improve the economy, tackle insecurity and fight corruption. But Nigeria is now the world's poverty capital, with nearly 100 million people living in extreme poverty. There's also a persistent insecurity problem with ongoing insurgency, killings and kidnappings. Analysts say the government needs to step up to the challenge.
It's very important to make merit and competence a yardstick for appointment into public office, and not personal trust and loyalty, as was the case in the first 4 years. So the president, I think, should make that decision now, in the light of this reality, to lead Nigeria as a united country aimed at delivering good governance to all and sundry across board.
On the streets, there is hope ahead of Buhari's next 4 years.
I'm hopeful Nigeria will be better. I'm hopeful our infrastructures will be much more developed. I'm hopeful that we'll get things right this next 4 years.
Employment is the key factor that is causing the insecurity problem we have in the country. If there's job, I think people will be engaged rather than looking into criminality.
President Buhari is also expected to reshuffle his cabinet as he works to deliver his pledges.
In the presence of world leaders and Nigerian officials, President Muhammadu Buhari will be taking up a new oath in office. It will be his final term according to the Constitution. His promise to improve the lives of over 200 million citizens between now and the year 2023. Phil Ihaza, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
So then, ahead of Mr. Buhari's inauguration for his second term in office in the next 24 hours, what are the pressing issues, the must-do items that he has to tackle? Let's find out. CGTN's Phil Ihaza joins us now live from Abuja. Phil, let's address the timing question first. The elections were held all the way back in February 23rd, as I recall. So why is the inauguration being held nearly 3 months later?
Well, okay, thank you, Ramah. Well, the inauguration date, which is May 29th, is the official date for the inauguration and handing over by the Constitution. If you recall that it's been a culture since 1999, when the military handed over power to what is termed the longest civilian rule since Nigeria gained its independence in 1960. But, you know, of course, there might be efforts to move that date, but it has to be constitutionally done. The president has approved, given an executive order for Democracy Day, which was also termed May 29 initially, to move to June 12, but that's just for the Democracy Day to be celebrated. But the inauguration, official inauguration, it's been a culture, you know, since 1999, and has to be constitutionally amended for it to be official. And also, if you look at it, elections can hold before that date. We've seen elections hold in April, we've seen elections hold in February, and all of that. As long as it holds before May 29, I think it behooves the Electoral Commission to decide when to hold the elections.
All right then. So Nigeria, though, from a purely economic standpoint, is one of the lowest tax revenue to GDP ratios in the world. It's in the high single digits, 7%, as I recall. But Mr. Buhari has failed to decisively reverse that trend in his first term in office. What can he do differently in the next 4 years?
Well, if you look at it, Nigeria has the largest economy in Africa. If you look at the GDP currently, though it's not doing so well as far back as 2012 and 2014, but it's still around the range of $375 billion. And if you look at the fact that our GDP growth rate has been also very slow, but it's been moving. I think the previous one was 2.0, 2018. But then if you look at the tax rate ratio, it hasn't really done so well. For example, we were supposed to meet a target of about $18 billion in 2018 for us to change or improve the tax revenue ratio to GDP, but with all the efforts made by the Federal Inland Revenue Service to boost the figures up, they did remarkably well, over 40% actually, to hit very, very remarkable figures. We only did about $14 billion, so we didn't hit the mark that we were supposed to do, even with all the efforts, the amnesty program for people to declare their assets and income so that we can be, the country can be properly taxed. So it's not as if the country is not doing well in terms of generating tax, but we need to do more if you compare it to the kind of output that the country is generating currently. But I think that with more initiatives like the amnesty program that the service introduced in the previous years and previous administration, more programs like that, I'm sure that will do better in our tax revenue generated as compared to the GDP.
All right, then one last question for you, Phil. So last year, Nigeria got roughly $2.2 billion in FDI, according to UNCTAD data. Egypt and South Africa, they got 4 times and 3 times as much FDI, respectively. But from Mr. Buhari's perspective, does he see this comparatively smaller of FDI flowing into Nigeria? Does he see it as a problem?
Well, if you look at the body language and the activities of Mr. President, you know that he's been in and about several countries outside of Nigeria, marketing the country, talking about investment opportunities. So, of course, that may be a concern, a source of concern to Mr. President to see how he can boost the FDI, the foreign direct investment. Even Ghana currently is the highest in West Africa. They did over $1 billion compared to Nigeria in 2018. And that tells you also that there are several factors affecting the foreign direct investment. When you look at insecurity challenges, for example, several investors might have obviously would have moved to other neighboring countries to invest. You're looking at a very, very wide margin of infrastructure deficits, close to $28 billion, in spite of the funds borrowed for capital project and infrastructure. We still haven't closed that gap, and that's a very huge factor. Of course, power is one of them, the key factors. So these are some of the reasons why the FDI may have been doing very poorly, but I'm sure that the next administration, the president will want to put his foot down to do even more than he did in the previous administration.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you very much. That's Phil Hihaza there from Abuja, Nigeria. Now, we're still in the general West African region. The government in Ghana has suspended indefinitely the exportation of all leafy veggies from the country to any international market. Now, the ban comes in the wake of concerns that vegetables produced in the country contain harmful organisms, which, if not addressed, could essentially mean that the EU would place a ban on all vegetable exports from Ghana. Here's CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai with an explanation.
The government says it has banned the export of all leafy vegetables and some selected groups of chili pepper and cucumbers indefinitely because of what it is calling unhealthy practices by exporters. Ghana recently came out of a ban on vegetable exports to the European Union, but those exports of chili pepper, bottle gourds, laffa gourds, bitter gourds and eggplants are still being monitored closely. The Vegetable Producers and Exporters Association of Ghana has criticized the blanket ban. The association says identifying defaulting exporters and penalizing them is a better option. Ghana lost $30 million in revenue between 2014 and 2017 as a result of the ban on vegetable exports into the European Union. No estimates yet on how much revenue will be lost because of this latest ban. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
South African industry will be subject to a long-delayed carbon tax on the 1st of June. This comes after President Cyril Ramaphosa signed that policy into law. Now, it's a first for a developing country, and this coal-heavy economy is now putting a price on pollution. But campaigners say the price on carbon isn't high enough. Here's CGTN's Alexandria Majala with more.
Carbon is Africa's worst polluter. And for this reason, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has signed into law a carbon tax to cut emissions. Ramaphosa has communicated the urgent need for action around the climate crisis, and the move is drawing cautious praise from environmentalists.
Is this a sign of a strong environmental will from President Cyril Ramaphosa? We don't think so. We think that it's one step forward, but in order to meet the crisis that we're facing, we need to take much more ambitious, much stronger action than we're seeing with the carbon tax bill.
The tax, a rare step for an emerging economy, will be levied from June 1st on greenhouse gases from fuel combustion and industrial processes, as well as emissions. Set at $8.30 per ton of carbon dioxide, the tax will be largely offset by allowances to lower it to an effective rate of between 41 cents and $3.13 in the first 3 years.
Greenpeace is really concerned that the carbon tax is not set at a level that will actually mean that it will act as an incentive for companies to shift away from fossil fuels.
Climate change represents one of the biggest challenges facing humankind, and the primary objective of the carbon tax is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a sustainable, cost-effective and affordable manner. The tax was part of South Africa's efforts to meet the global climate change agreement negotiated in Paris in 2015. According to Greenpeace, South Africa, which relies largely on coal for its energy supply, is the 14th largest polluter in the world and the largest in Africa. Alexandria Mashala for CGTN.
So then, this new carbon tax law will affect all businesses operating within South Africa's borders. And there shouldn't be any surprises since the country's national treasury has been working on this law for years. CGTN's Angela Coppola has a recap.
Companies operating in South Africa have known about the carbon tax since 2010. Stakeholders have been canvassed several times and contributed to the new laws. Some companies have been changing the energy-intensive components of their products in anticipation of this new tax regime.
So what we've done to mitigate that, we've already for a number of years been working at extending our cement products a lot more to reduce the amount of clinker. The exact financial impact, we're not that clear yet because there's still a few uncertainties, but our estimate is anything between 4 and 5 million rand a month at the moment, purely based on AfriSam's operations and the products we produce.
Companies that have looked at their entire production cycle to isolate potential tax exposures will make a difference in terms of the environment and their exposure to the new tax.
For instance, we have reduced electrical consumption by installing highly efficient electrical motors. We have upgraded our kilns with the latest pre-calciner and preheater technology, which reduce your requirements for thermal fuels.
The regulations controlling the actual CO2 limits remain unresolved, however, and many in the manufacturing sector are a little concerned.
I'm not too concerned about the base point. It's just an issue of that it's not been agreed yet. So it needs to be agreed through the Association for Cementitious Material Producers. We are engaging with government on this issue. And obviously the easiest way of doing it is to, in actual fact, look at the average of the industry. And in that instance, some of the producers will obviously benefit and others will not benefit from it. But I think that's the fairest way of doing it.
The South African tax collectors are efficient, but manufacturers and producers want to see their taxes put to good use.
Some of the other producers will say, I'd rather pay the tax because I'm not sure what's going to happen to it. And that's my biggest concern. Since it's not been ring-fenced, it will disappear in fiscus and it will be used for other purposes.
The tax authorities have split implementation into 2 phases, with some allowances in the first 5 years, aimed at providing some breathing room to those businesses.
Then it will increase by inflation plus 2%. And that's quite a big number, but we will try and be transparent about the way we pass on the tax levy so that customers can make informed choices, because ultimately what you really want, this is not a financial issue, this is about protecting the environment and using products that are green friendly.
There's no question that companies that haven't prepared thoroughly for carbon tax are going to feel the pain financially, and it could impact their businesses very adversely. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in the Northwest Province of South Africa.
All right then, so it's been years in the making, but has this carbon tax been completely watered down beyond recognition? Let's find out. CGTN's Angelo Coppola stays with that story. He joins us now live from Johannesburg, thankfully without the hard hat, from location. So Treasury pointing out that the initial tax is about $8.34 per tonne emitted, but they're also saying that the effective price is actually going to be a lot lower, anywhere between 40 US cents to about $3.28. But how does this tax and the applicable tax breaks, how do they work?
Well, look, Ramah, bottom line here is it's going to be phased in. There are two phases that we know about. First phase lasts until December 2022, in fact. Second phase kicks in from January the 1st, 2023 to 2030. And it does appear that phase one is going to be a bit of a soft touch. That's according to National Treasury. There are significant tax-free emission allowances that range from 60% to 95% in this phase. Analysts are suggesting that the National Treasury are going out of their way to allay any fears that certain industry sectors might have that this could damage their businesses seriously. On the details, there's a basic tax-free allowance of 60% for all activities that you mentioned earlier, and a maximum 10% allowance for companies that use carbon offsets to reduce their tax liability. So there are a couple of carbon tax or carbon offset trading options that are starting to spring up. We know that one was launched by the JSE about 18 months ago. They'll be used by those businesses that have got their ducks in a row environmentally already and have started introducing those measures to reduce their exposures. And they'll be looking for some upside when they're trading those, let's call them carbon credits. Because they put so much effort in, they want to see what kind of returns they're going to get. Those platforms, of course, haven't seen any action just yet, because everyone's waiting for that starting gun to get fired next week. However, it's not expected to see any kind of activity in the very near term, because people and businesses are going to be watching for somebody to go onto that platform to try and sell or buy a carbon trading option, as it were. So we're going to have to wait for that thing or that element to settle down, and then hopefully we'll start seeing some trading happen there, Ramah.
Right. So Treasury also argued in the statement that this introduction of the tax, in their words, will not have any impact on the price of electricity for the first phase. But given that most of South Africa's power comes from an aging fleet of coal power plants, is Treasury essentially giving a lifeline here to Eskom at least until 2022?
Well, it's a bit of a moot point, isn't it, really, because that seems to be the general idea. They are getting a lifeline, although we haven't seen any official paperwork in that regard. But let's remember that industry is already going to feel the pain, because Eskom increases in tariffs are already in play. They just kicked in about a month ago, and there's another increase coming in towards the end of the year, and then another one in 2020 and 2021. So those tariff increases are happening anyway. And that's because Eskom's trying to pay off its debt and the interest that it owes on that debt. So the carbon tax might not have an impact on those prices, but the tariff increases will do. So there's no issue really there. There is going to be an increase. And that's already a bone of contention amongst the industry players. And this is happening in a contracting economy where job losses and business closures are the order of the day. There's also another issue at stake at Eskom here. It's non-compliance to SO2 emission levels. It hasn't met those levels for years, in fact. And the utility has been pumping out SO2 into the environment for years and affecting communities that live close by to them. And this, while the private sector doesn't have a choice, they have to adhere, the likes of Sasol and other companies, including the cement company we were with today. So it appears that government will probably give Eskom those exemptions and that lifeline. But we're hoping, against hope, that they'll actually start treating Eskom as a business entity and start treating them equally as they do with the other private sector enterprises. Ramah?
Indeed, and certainly not as an emitting piggyback, as it were. We'll leave it there for the time being. Angela Coppola in Johannesburg, thank you very much. Here's a run through some corporate headlines now. All right, then, focusing on some of the companies that are actually going to be affected by that carbon tax. Shareholders of both precious metal miners, Sibanye-Stillwater, and their struggling rival, Lonmin, have approved the planned merger of the firms. That effectively creates the world's second largest platinum producer. Earlier this month, South African regulators cleared the way for the takeover, blocking Lonmin's main mining union's attempt to nullify the deal. In the telco world, Africa's biggest single wireless carrier, MTN, has revealed plans to build a marketplace app where customers will be able to buy anything from insurance to washing machines. Now, this comes as the South African operator is looking to build its mobile money platform, Momo, into Africa's biggest bank. MTN is currently trying to simplify its business portfolio and to release at least $1 billion worth of capital over the next 3 years as it transforms its business model. Still in telcos, Airtel Africa is considering listing on the London stock market as the continent's second largest mobile operator is looking to cut its debt levels. The group is owned by Bharti Airtel of India. It's weighing up a premium listing in which at least 25% of the shares would be freely floated. Last October, it raised about $1.25 billion from 6 global investors, giving it a company value of about $4.4 billion. And the Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba is exploring a potential second listing in Hong Kong. That could raise as much as $20 billion. It's said to be the biggest follow-on share sale in nearly 7 years. The tech titan is expected to officially file an application for this Hong Kong listing as early as the second half of the year. And that's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. It's time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. We'll look at the latest rate-setting decision from Kenya's Monetary Policy Committee as the governor comes to the end of his first term. And what can Kenya learn from China and vice versa in the world of financial inclusion? All that and more is coming up next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. Only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Naro.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business. Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Let's focus on East Africa for a moment. Kenya's reached out to the World Bank seeking an urgent loan for budgetary support. In a letter to the Washington-based lender, the East African nation has requested for all of $750 million. Now, the loan request is seen as yet another sign of the ever-growing public debt that has seen Kenya go to the extent of borrowing in order to repay existing loans. That's basically what happened earlier in the month of May. Now, if approved, this will be the first time in about a decade that the World Bank is actually putting cash directly into the Treasury to be used at the discretion of the government. Earlier this month, Kenya raised about $2.1 billion in a sovereign bond. At the same time, the Central Bank of Kenya has, for the 6th time in a row, left its benchmark lending rate essentially unchanged at 9%. The Apex Bank attributed the subsequent hold of the crucial rate to the optimum performance, in their view, of the general economy amidst volatility jitters both internally and externally. There's a broad range of factors explaining that. Now, remember, this is the last Monetary Policy Committee meeting which Dr. Patrick Njoroge is presiding over in his first term as Kenya Central Bank Governor. So what has the last 4 years been like? Let's explore that. Reginald Kazutu is the Chief Investment Officer at Amana Capital, who's in the studio right now. Welcome back.
Thank you, Ram.
So, first time, 4 years, how would you grade him?
I'll grade him on 2 scales. One which I'll give him an E for effort, because generally a central bank governor in a developing country, your job is not supposed to be just mere regulatory. It's supposed to be a bit promotional and developmental in perspective. So we would have expected him to see an increase in capital formation in terms of savings and households through the commercial institutions or financial institutions, and that money ending up in the productive side of the economy, roads, infrastructure, and all. Now, that's a central bank that is concerned about economic growth in a developing country. In that front, I don't think he has done much.
But can we really blame him for some of those things? Because if you think about it from the perspective of if you're sitting in his shoes, right, and you essentially have your hands tied with something like the Banking Amendment Act of 2016, you've got no effective control of what savings rates are going to be, right? And that interferes with your job. It's literally a bunch of 200 and something legislators sitting back and saying, you have to set savings rates here, you have to set retail rates here. What can you do at that point? Your hands are tied.
Yes, and that's why I said I'll rate him two ways. On that one, I'll rate him an E. On the other one, which is now contextual, he came in, I don't think he understood the full extent of the mess that he was getting himself into. The other main job of a central bank is price stability, exchange rate stability, banking sector stability, and all. In terms of price stability, he has managed to keep a bit a lead on the demand side of inflation, whether that was throughout his own genius or just because there's just no velocity of the money in the economy. So there's been no demand pressure. But we can credit it to him because we don't have evidence of the contrary. Exchange rate, we know how he has managed to manage the shilling at where currently it is, and it has not been volatile. So in those two, given the circumstances that he found himself in a very indebted country with a huge external debt, to manage to keep price levels and the exchange rate where they are is commendable. But not being
related question on that, because when you talk about inflation, and I know inflation targeting has been the sort of buzzword in monetary policy circles around this end of the world, but to the extent that the bulk of CPI in this country is food and its fuel issues, and these are two elements that, let's be honest, the central bank has absolutely no control over, right? It's not something you can tinker with by raising rates or reducing the amount of money that's in circulation. Playing around with M3 doesn't really matter. It's agnostic to that particular issue. Is that whole idea of inflation targeting even valid?
If I would quote the words of Milton Friedman, inflation targeting is literally nonsense. The only thing a central bank should worry about, depending on the school of thought of economics that you follow, is actually money supply. Because what money does in terms of the increase in the quantity of money in circulation or M3 is what actually either drives aggregate demand, national income, and employment. Targeting inflation, as you said, the inflation that we find on this side of the globe is normally cost push. It's not demand pull, and they have no tools whatsoever to deal with cost push inflation. But yes, it's fancy terminology to say we are targeting inflation. But really, what they should be more worried about is the growth of money supply. That's really what they have in their control. At the end of the day, because even interest rates are not in their control, because ideally they can set their benchmark rate. The market can decide to go whatever direction they want to go. So the only tool that the central bank actually has is actually money supply.
Right. Let's get back to what they said in the MPC meeting, because there was a whole range of, shall we say, contradictory numbers that were coming through here. Because on one hand, they point out to what they described as strong growth in lending, and manufacturing stood out because they were saying that we've seen a near 8% increase year on year up to the end of April. But you then turn around to the Industry Association and they say that their margins are flat or falling in the first quarter of the year, and only 20% of them are running even close at full capacity, roughly half operating at somewhere between 40 and 30%. So if you have more lending going in there and yet the company is operating at below capacity, there's a huge mismatch there, isn't it?
Yes, and it's something that we've been facing as a country, where statistics and what is on the ground, they are completely at different crossroads. Looking at the manufacturing sector itself, if you look at the Stanbic PMI, which gauges manufacturing sector sentiment in terms of they're going to expand and all that stuff, actually went below 50. Means that they are not expanding.
There's contraction.
There's actually contraction. So what are they borrowing money for is the question that comes. Or are they just trying to borrow to cover loans from the other side? demand. But again, we look at it at the aggregate level. The total private sector growth is still way below 12%, which is the central bank's target itself. It was around 4.35, 4.9. And as long as the aggregate figure is not increasing, then we will not see aggregate demand increase in the economy. Then it is also a bit foolhardy to increase lending when there is no demand. So I have
because
the loan.
Non-food, non-fuel inflation is actually pretty subdued. It's below 5%.
Yes, exactly. So you're giving me money to expand, but who's going to buy it? So I'll get the money, I will not expand. Actually, the banks are going to reach a level where people actually don't want the money, because what makes an entrepreneur grow their business or expand their business is the future return that they're about to get. It's the return they'll get from expanding. If I expand, I'm going to get demand. If there's no demand pushing manufacturing to expand production, then even looking at the rate of credit to that sector doesn't make sense. There are other things that we need to fix. And I think as policymakers, they need to look at more at policies that affect aggregate demand in the economy, and the supply side is actually not the problem.
All right, one last question, very, very quickly. Dr. Njoroge, second term in office, would you appoint him back?
Yes, I think I would appoint him back because he needs to keep the shilling where it is. Because if it actually goes to its real value, then the country is in a mess with all this borrowing that we are doing. Bring someone else in. I think what we need to do for the central bank is to depoliticize the central bank. Because whoever comes in is still a political player. They have to play tune to what the government wants. Unlike like the Federal Reserve, they make their decisions independent of the government of the day, to the best interest of the public and the country as a whole. Country like central bank doesn't do that.
Okay, we'll leave it there for the time being. Reginald Kizutu, thank you very much. All right then, so we've covered, of course, the monetary policy issues in Kenya, but it's time for a short break on the program. Here's what's coming up next. Huawei has filed formal complaints after 2 of its parcels were diverted by the US company FedEx. And this year marks the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. We're looking back at the country's history.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are 2 of the major cities I grew up in.
Business in Africa is high risk.
After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Ucheo Koronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN.
Welcome back. Let's recap the headlines making your stories at this hour. Starting with Niger, the country's president, Mahamadou Issoufou, has met the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, and other senior officials on his 5-day state visit to the country. Over the years, the 2 countries have enjoyed positive relations in their diplomatic ties. They were resumed back in 1996. Peter Mutharika has been sworn in as the president of Malawi for a 2nd term after a rather contentious election marred by allegations of fraud and vote rigging. The Electoral Commission announced on Monday that Mutharika, who heads the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, had narrowly won last week's vote after an injunction barring the release of the results was lifted. Elsewhere, the newly appointed Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo is set to announce the names of ministers who will be heading various government units. Professor Sylvester Ilinkamba faces a challenge in reconciling the demands of the President, Felix Tshisekedi, and his predecessor, Joseph Kabila. And over in Sudan, a nationwide strike by workers has paralyzed services in both the public and the private sectors. bus and air passengers, for instance, were left stranded as transportation services were disrupted. The strike is aimed at forcing the ruling Transitional Military Council to hand over power to civilian rule. The two-day strike was called by the Alliance for Freedom and Change, which has been at loggerheads with the military council. That's a run through your headlines. All right, then on to matters further afield. Huawei, the Chinese tech giant, says that the US logistics giant FedEx has diverted 2 parcels destined for a Huawei address in Asia to the United States. Now, the Chinese tech company says that this move was done without authorization. FedEx, it says, also attempted to reroute 2 other parcels. Huawei said the 4 packages only contained documents and no technology whatsoever, and they have filed a formal complaint with China's postal regulator. A FedEx spokeswoman said that the packages were diverted in error and denied that the US government or anyone else had asked them to send these packages to alternative destinations. Elsewhere, the Trump administration's proposed list of Chinese imports facing tariffs includes more than 1,300 products, among them electronics, medical equipment, even batteries. Experts are now saying that the increase will likely be passed on to US consumers, raising concerns about how they will react to higher prices. Here's Karina Huber with more from New York.
$50 billion worth of goods made in China, including flat-screen TVs, medical devices, and airplane components, are being targeted by the Trump administration for proposed import tariffs of 25%. Excluded from the list are clothing, toys, and electronic devices like cell phones and laptops. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer says the list was compiled to create the lowest consumer impact. The products are largely industrial, but economists say U.S. consumers could still see an increase in prices.
You're not looking at a really smack in the gut to consumer, but you are looking for some episodic goods where the prices could potentially go up significantly.
Some U.S. consumers are worried.
Yeah, I'm really concerned. I'm concerned because I'm a single working mom. I'm a school teacher, and my dollar doesn't go very far as it is. So any increase would definitely cause me to shop less.
Others say if prices go up, they will become more selective.
I would probably think about the purchase a little bit more, but ultimately, if it was something I really wanted, I would probably still purchase it.
It just really depends on what I'm buying, I guess. If it's like necessities, then yes. But if it's irrelevant, then not really.
Depending on the item. Like, buying a large screen TV, if it's going up 25%, I'm only going to buy that once, so many years. Whereas I'm buying a calculator, made in China or whatever else, I may hold off on buying or finding a cheaper model.
Robert Brusca and other economists say even if U.S. consumers pull back on buying goods imported from China, the impact on the U.S. economy will likely be minimal. Moody's Analytics estimates the proposed tariffs, in addition to those already imposed on Chinese steel and aluminum, could shave U.S. economic growth by about 0.2% this year and 0.1% next year.
When consumers spend goods on imports, on goods that are made in China, there's an increase in GDP because they spend money on these goods. And there's a decrease in GDP because they were imported. And so the impact of buying goods from China on GDP is very small.
What the impact will be on U.S. consumers is another question.
U.S. consumers can rest easy for now. The tariffs don't go into effect until after a review period. The Trump administration is soliciting feedback from U.S. businesses that have until May 22nd to file final objections. Karina Huber, CGTN, New York.
Now, more than 2 years after the U.S. President Donald Trump walked away from a regional Asia-Pacific trade agreement, the world's largest and third largest economies, that's the U.S. and Japan, are now negotiating a deal of their own. And they are eager to strike a deal as elections in both countries are really getting close. But there are still several difficulties to overcome before President Trump and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe can both get what they want.
President Donald Trump says nothing will be finalized with Japan on trade before the country's upper house elections in July. This might be a relief for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, giving him more time to come up with the best terms. If he makes concessions to import taxes on U.S. farm products in exchange for Washington to not raise tariffs on Japanese cars, it would be a great news for both Japanese car makers and U.S. farmers. But it would reflect badly on himself and Japan's credibility. A bilateral deal on the side with a protectionist country could be interpreted as betrayal to the other 10 countries in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and a contradiction to Japan's image as a free trade advocate. If he goes tough and says no to favorable terms for U.S. companies, he may risk damaging Japan's pillar, car industry. U.S. farm producers are hurting now. Take wine, for example. There is no duty on wine entering Japan from the EU and TPP member Chile. And wine from Australia, another TPP member, has a 5.6% tariff that would soon drop to 0. But wine from California, a U.S. state, has a 15% tariff. Officials from both countries have indicated they want to wrap up negotiations quickly. But another obstacle is the coverage of the deal. During April's talks at the White House, Tokyo reportedly hoped to limit the scope of the talks to trade in goods, while Washington wants a comprehensive free trade accord. This would include e-commerce and music distribution services per se. Japan's trade deficit against the U.S. in 2018 was around $67 billion, the fourth largest after China, Mexico, and Germany. U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin has said Washington wants trade deals to prevent Japan from manipulating its currency to boost exports. Similar clauses are seen in the revised NAFTA. The Japanese finance minister said his country wouldn't accept linking currency policy with trade matters. Trump and Abe will meet again at the G20 summit in Japan's Osaka next month, where Trump is also expected to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping. CGTN.
On to Europe now. Its newly passed copyright laws are designed to bring sweeping, changing reforms to how content is posted online and then governed and shared. One area that's being very closely watched, however, are memes. Humorous images and videos that spread rapidly across the internet. CGTN's Mariam Zaidi filed this report from Brussels.
The meme. Whether it comes in the form of a picture, a video or just a text, they often have us laughing and sharing with our friends and contacts all over social media. They first burst onto the internet back in the early 1990s. Then, thanks to apps and platforms such as Vine and YouTube, memes took off. A new directive was recently passed by the European Parliament, the first change to copyright rules in decades. It requires online platforms to filter or remove copyrighted material from their websites. Many are worried the regulation will kill memes.
When a platform company, and I want to underline that they are companies, huge companies, which makes hundreds of billions by using the work of others, that these companies must pay for making money from the creations of others.
What the European Parliament sought to do was to hold for-profit companies responsible. They won't be able to post material without a copyright license and will be forced to apply filters to content to ensure nothing copyrighted was uploaded. In addition, an exception for parodies was put in place so many people can still spread memes.
This sort of creations, which has a purpose of parody, of humor, is not affected by the new legislation. So memes will be able to stay as we know them.
When it comes to memes, it seems that the sky is the limit if, of course, you're not a for-profit platform. But critics of the EU copyright law also argue that the consequence of an upload filter could actually lock in the dominance of platforms like YouTube because small startups would be discouraged by the legislative burden. Mariam Zaidi, CGTN, Brussels.
Now, 2019 is the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. So starting this week, the authorities over there will release information regarding national development covering all provinces, autonomous regions and municipalities. On Tuesday, the government held its first such briefing on Hebei province, which encircles the national capital and the neighbouring city of Tianjin. CGTN's reporter Zhang Yubing has more.
Hebei, the closest province to China's capital city of Beijing, continues to gain economic momentum. According to the press briefing, last year, Hebei's provincial GDP reached over 3.6 trillion yuan, That's about 521 billion US dollars, and nearly 880 times higher than the GDP of 70 years ago when New China was established. This year's first quarter GDP growth stood at a robust 7.4%.
People's living standards have greatly improved, and the incomes of urban and rural residents have increased as well. With these, Hebei's people are heading towards building a moderately prosperous society in all respects.
Wang stressed the province's efforts in environmental protection, since its heavy industrial structure still poses threats to good air quality in the Beijing-Tianjin-Hebei region, which is now in a coordinated development.
Instead of sacrificing the blue sky, we would rather lose some GDP. And through coordination in the region, tackling air pollution has made important phased achievements.
Last year, the average density of PM2.5 in Hebei was 56 micrograms, a 48% drop from 2013, when the region suffered from the thick haze. Behind the change was the shutdown of over 120,000 polluters in 5 years. And Wang says those efforts will continue, not just in the air, but also water and soil. The province is now taking advantage of new opportunities, like the planning and construction of the Xiong'an New Area south of Beijing, which is the third such area in China, following 2 others in Shenzhen and Shanghai. Hebei is also preparing for the 2022 Winter Olympics as a co-host along with Beijing. Officials say these efforts are moving along as planned. With past and present efforts, Hebei province is getting ambitious and taking the opportunities, like the official said, forging ahead with a new journey for its people. Zheng Yibing, CGTN, Beijing.
All right then, a quick run through some commodity prices here for you. I'm going to focus on cocoa for tonight. Ghana might be coming to the market with notes of about 20-year durations. Pricing, of course, is pricing and timing yet to be determined. But the proceeds ostensibly be used to pay off legacy costs for the cocoa board and create a buffer for future operations as well. Cocoa futures as well, down about 0.447% lower on a year-to-date basis a little earlier today. At those levels, have pretty much erased a lot of the losses that we've seen so far in 2019. Here's what's coming up next. We'll introduce you to the app that lets users set their own fare for a selected route in South Africa. Right then, welcome back to the program. You're watching Global Business Africa. Now, one of Africa's few but greatest success stories is the sheer speed with which digital finance has transformed access to finance across the continent. Africa, as we speak, is now home to almost half of nearly 700 million individual digital finance users worldwide. And that's why one of the world's leaders in financial innovation, China, is now looking to increase the amounts of collaboration it has with the continent. Here's my colleague, CGTN's Uche Koronko, with more.
In Kenya's capital, Nairobi, stakeholders in Africa and China's digital finance space are mulling over accelerating digital financial inclusion through collaboration. It will be a critical partnership. Africa is now home to more digital financial service deployments than any other region in the world. China has robust, innovative new providers, products and business models such as Alipay or Tenpay, which are integrating financial services into existing e-commerce or social media platforms.
So there's a lot we can learn from them in terms of what are the infrastructure required to develop digital systems that allow financial integration. What are the regulations that we need? What are the resources that we need?
And that is why the Chinese Academy of Financial Inclusion put together this China-Africa Digital Financial Inclusion Summit. They believe that not only can China provide the capital and technological know-how, it also opens the door to investment from its fintech giants, and it could better promote the Belt and Road Initiative.
Frankly speaking, most of the Chinese people are not really know what happened in Africa, vice versa, right? So the platform, like as a knowledge center or exchanging of views, information, is very, very important. So CAFE believe this is the beginning. So we need, but it's a necessary. It's a really helpful for the Chinese Belt Road initiatives, and even for the business purpose. These Chinese companies, they have a kind of a demand to look at.
It's based on repay as you want, which means its over 5 million users can access a loan of thousands of dollars in 3 minutes, and they can adjust repayment periods, dates and amounts without any default fines. The firm, which serves as an intermediary between financial institutions and individual borrowers, has potential by creating platforms like this that facilitate communication and foster collaboration. Ucheo Koronkwo, CGTN, Nairobi.
Is that passengers and drivers can decide just how much they want to spend and who they want to drive with.
Let's say 40 rand. Bring our fare to drivers. As you can see on the screen, it's basically going to the drivers that are closest or within the vicinity in real time. So let's see, even though it's a bit more expensive, I'm going to go with just that. Because I need to get there in a rush. That's one of the life hacks of InDriver. If you're in a rush, you can just sort of add it with increments of, 2 rand or 10 rand. So here's my driver. He's accepted my ride. He's happy with 50 rand and he'll arrive in.
Passengers protested against the high fares. Just months after InDriver launched, more than 60,000 people had joined.
The response has been amazing. It's been incredible. We've actually watched the growth. We've launched in Cape Town and now in Johannesburg, and we've seen how people are, they're gravitating towards the fact that, hey, I'm getting more value for my money. I'm in control.
InDriver has already made its debut in 200 cities across Eastern Europe and Latin America. Arusha in Tanzania was the first African city to get the app at the end of 2018. Drivers too are seeing the benefits.
I was working with the other in-hailing companies, and now I'm with InDriver because they are charging less commission, and currently we're not being charged any commission. They will charge us after 6 months. Commission is 5 to 8%. It's actually way lower because you look at the other in-hailing companies, they are charging us 25%.
InDriver may be competition for existing transport services, but it's a new option for travelers wanting a quick and cheap ride. Sumitra Nadu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
All right, then a quick run through the currencies here for you. Not much of a change, at least in the ones that we do track, managed and floating currencies included. But we're about a week out from Zambia's decision to kick out, or at least initiate the process of kicking out Vedanta Resources, which also owns a majority of Konkola copper mines. But the currency over there is still flashing red flags. At Kwacha, 13.472 with the dollar at 1620 GMT. Earlier today, the country's finance minister said she'd be curating a list of loans that would be considered for, in her words, slowing down, postponing, or cancellation. We'll see how that plays out and how the market responds on the Kwacha and, of course, on Zambia's Eurobonds as well. But that's it for tonight's edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, we'd like to hear your thoughts on all the content you've seen here in the last hour. We'd really love to hear your ideas, all the ways you can get your feedback back to us on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.